All right, welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in. When we think of great leaders, especially highly decorated military generals, we usually picture these people of pure, unfiltered action, right? We imagine folks barking orders, moving incredibly fast, and just reacting on raw instinct in the heat of the moment. But today, well, today we're going to absolutely shatter that myth. We're looking at the career, the mindset, and the really deep discipline of General Jim Mattis, drawing from a fantastic review of his book Call Sign Chaos. And through his story, we're going to explore exactly why true leaders absolutely must read books. To kick things off, I want you to listen to this incredibly aggressive quote. It perfectly sets the stakes for what we're talking about today. Mattis says, "If you haven't read hundreds of books learning from others who went before you, you are functionally illiterate. You can't coach and you can't lead." I mean, wow, functionally illiterate. So the crucial takeaway here is that if you aren't actively reading, you are fundamentally disqualified from effective leadership. Relying on your daily experience alone, it just isn't going to cut it. Which leads us to a pretty fascinating question. How exactly does one of the military's most formidable generals prepare for absolute chaos? How do you ready yourself for a battlefield where the grand plan just goes completely out the window the second that first shot is fired? Well, the answer is incredibly surprising. It isn't just more physical training, and it isn't just running more tactical drills. The actual answer is relentless, quiet, disciplined study. Okay, moving into section 1, the functionally illiterate leader. A lot of well-meaning leaders out there think their personal, on-the-job experience is totally enough to get them through any crisis. But Mattis argues that relying solely on your own limited personal experience without reading the accounts of those who actually came before you is a massive leadership liability. You're essentially wandering in the dark, trying to invent the wheel from scratch while the bullets are literally flying. The core principle here is that there is absolutely no substitute for constant study to master one's craft. Now, Mattis firmly believes that having a mentor is crucial. Everyone needs a mentor, and honestly, everyone should strive to be one. But having a great mentor doesn't absolve you from putting in the work yourself. Constant personal study is the non-negotiable foundation of leadership. You just have to put in those lonely hours with your nose in a book to truly master your craft. Section 2, the warrior monk's secret. Let's take a look at how Mattis's battlefield unpredictability, the exact thing that made him so terrifying to adversaries, was actually fueled by hours and hours of quiet, solitary study. He's famous for nicknames like Mad Dog and Chaos, which, by the way, is actually an acronym for Does the Colonel Have Another Outstanding Solution, which I love. These sound wild, aggressive, completely action-oriented. But his other nickname is the Warrior Monk. And he earned that because he never married and devoted his entire life to intense historical study. It proves that fierce tactical execution on the battlefield actually requires deep, isolated contemplation beforehand. Get this, 22. When Mattis was appointed as the Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation for NATO, which was this massively complex multinational role under President Obama, do you know how he prepared for it? He read exactly 22 books, just for that one single role. He didn't just wing it based on his decades of prior service. No, he hit the books to understand the very specific historical, political, and strategic context of exactly what he was walking into. Now, if you're sitting there right now thinking, well, okay, that's great for a general with a huge staff, but I'm just way too busy to read. Let's shatter that excuse right now. Reading is mandatory for every single rank in the Marine Corps. From the newest sergeants all the way up to the most senior colonels and generals, they are all assigned a specific reading list that they must consume. At no rank is a Marine ever excused from studying. So look, if people deployed in active combat zones have the time and discipline to read, we certainly do too, right? On to Section 3, building a shock absorber. This is the absolute core concept of our explainer today. Why does reading act as a massive tactical advantage in chaotic environments? It's not just about looking smart at a dinner party, it is quite literally a vital survival tool. It all comes down to this definition, the shock absorber. Mattis defines this as living in history to realize there are lots of old solutions to new problems. Think about it. When chaos hits, if you haven't read history, you take the full, brutal, physical and emotional impact of that shock. You panic. But if you study the past, your knowledge cushions the blow. You realize, okay, people have faced this exact type of crisis in ancient Rome, or during World War II, or in the corporate battles of the 1980s. You suddenly have a massive catalog of ready-made solutions to apply to a seemingly unprecedented problem. Which brings us to a major pitfall of leadership, what Mattis calls strategic frustration. This happens when leaders fail to communicate clear intent, leaving their teams just completely guessing. But deep reading helps leaders synthesize complex ideas and communicate that intent with crystal clarity. For example, right before the 2003 March into Iraq, Mattis took all his strategic reading and condensed his commander's intent into a single one-page letter that was distributed to 22,000 troops. Just one page, completely unifying an entire division. That level of clarity, it only comes from a mind sharpened by reading. And if you want to know what ultimate clarity of intent looks like in a bureaucratic setting, consider this story. Mattis was leading the Joint Forces Command, which meant 2,800 servicemen, thousands of contractors, a massive budget, the whole shebang. Well, he realized the division was completely redundant. He wanted to save the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. So, in a high-level Joint Chiefs budget meeting, he didn't give some boring 50-slide presentation. He literally slid a paper napkin across the table to Admiral Mullen that just said, "Disband JFCOM Mattis." He fired himself with a 3-word napkin. I mean, that is the power of absolute strategic clarity. Section 4, 30 seconds, 30 years. Let's see how deep, solitary study translates directly into split-second, high-stakes decision-making, whether you're navigating a literal battlefield or a hostile corporate boardroom. So imagine this high-pressure scenario. Mattis was on the verge of being formally criticized for what some thought was an overly hasty response in battle. A military lawyer came up to him and asked a very pointed question. "General, how much time did you consider before authorizing the strike?" The lawyer actually knew from the official logs that from the moment Mattis was woken up in the middle of the night to the moment he authorized the strike, it had been less than 30 seconds. Mattis looked right at the lawyer and delivered this absolute mic drop response. About 30 years. And he wasn't being nonchalant or dismissive. The point he was beautifully making is that you don't make a 30-second decision in a vacuum. That rapid life-or-death choice rested firmly upon 30 entire years of rigorous reading, study, and operational experience. The books he read decades ago directly informed the instinct he trusted in that 30-second window. Section 5, the ultimate competitive advantage. Now, we've talked a lot about Mattis in the military context, but let's pivot and look at how you can adopt this exact historical framework into your own leadership toolkit starting today. You might recognize this famous framework, developed by an Air Force colonel known as the OODA loop: 1 observe, 2 orient, 3 decide, 4 act. In literally any competitive environment, business, sports, warfare, winning means repeating this cycle faster than your opponent. But here is the real secret sauce. Your speed through this loop is directly fueled by your reading habit. The more mental models and historical context you have from books, the faster you can orient yourself and make a decision. If your opponent hasn't read, they are going to get completely stuck trying to understand the situation, while you are already taking decisive action. Let's rapid fire a few of Mattis's best leadership axioms that stem from his lifelong study. These are gems you can use immediately. First, praise in public, criticize in private. It sounds simple, but it's widely ignored by amateur managers. Next, protect your mavericks. If you punish risk takers or those who bring intellectual ambushes, you'll only be left with the risk averse, which is absolutely fatal to innovation. And lastly, a principle he actually borrowed from George Washington: listen, learn, help, lead. Notice how lead is intentionally the very last step in that sequence. This next part brilliantly illustrates his utter obsession with clear communication. He'd ask himself, what do I know? Who needs to know? Have I told them? This was Mattis's legendary 3-question mantra. He repeated these questions so incessantly to his officers that they actually had them printed on index cards and taped right next to their office phones. Seriously, if you rigorously ask yourself these 3 questions every single day, you will eliminate an enormous amount of friction and confusion in your own organization. So, that brings us to our final, provocative question to wrap up this explainer. What's your competitive advantage loop? Are you constantly feeding your mind with history, strategy, and the hard-won experiences of others? Or are you stubbornly trying to figure it all out on your own? Look, the chaos is coming whether you are ready for it or not, and the best way to prepare is to build your shock absorber. So pick up a book, deeply study those who came before you, and then go lead.